further proceedings on the quorum call be dispensed with?
Without objection.
Earlier this week, I described the terrible flooding across my home state of Kentucky. Rivers reached historic levels. Whole communities are still underwater. Yesterday, my staff and I spoke with leaders in some of our hardest hit counties. The Estill County judge told me that he personally joined crews to help families escape danger. Small businesses and business owners in Lee County who survived one COVID obstacle after another now saw their life's work literally washed away. The situation in Powell County is so dire, at least one city can only be accessed by boat. Road crews, first responders, and the Kentucky National Guard are doing their best to help out, but they can't handle the full scope of the damage until the water recedes. Once the assessment is complete, the governor will formally request an emergency disaster declaration from the Biden administration. As soon as he does, my team and I will do our part to get federal assistance to these communities as soon as possible. Now, on a completely different matter, yesterday our Democratic colleagues had planned to begin ramming through their partisan spending spree, but it seems they've had some difficulty getting to the starting line. After all, Senate Democrats, including committee chairs, are essentially being jammed with text from over in the House. Their own members have barely been able to read this thing, let alone shape it. So let's think back to where we were 1 year ago. 11 and a half months ago, the Senate was also discussing a major spending package. In fact, it was the same size as what's being proposed right now, about $2 trillion, an appropriate price tag back at the start of the crisis. But that's where the similarity actually ends. Last March, the Senate was working overtime in a bipartisan fashion to craft good policy from the bottom up. I assembled bipartisan task forces. We had Republicans and Democrats and staff working around the clock to build the policies that would save our health system and our economy. The CARES Act sustained us for almost a year of shutdowns. It funded the health care fight, saved small businesses, and funded Operation Warp Speed, which helped pave the way for these pioneering vaccines and pre-ordered hundreds of millions of doses for Americans. The law sent so much relief to households that even as the GDP declined, personal income and savings actually went up. Even liberal economists say President Biden has inherited an economy that was already primed for a swift recovery. It was the largest American rescue package ever. Yet it passed the Senate without one single dissenting vote because it was built the right way. But that was last March. So what about today? Instead of heading into a dark tunnel, we're accelerating out of it. Incredible vaccines, a rebounding economy, that's what the Biden administration inherited, thanks to what we did last year. But Washington Democrats are trying to exploit the last chapters of this crisis to pass what President Biden's chief of staff calls, quote, the most progressive domestic legislation in a generation. And they've told Republicans, take it or leave it. No openness to meaningful bipartisan input. 10 Republican senators approached President Biden and proposed cooperation on the order of hundreds of billions of dollars. They were refused. All that interested Democrats was a partisan hodgepodge of largely non-COVID related items. Last year, the Democratic leader said that sitting in your own office, writing a bill, and then demanding the other side support it is not anyone's idea of bipartisanship. As recently as last November, he said we need a true bipartisan bill, not this is our bill, take it or leave it. Another time, our friend from New York told everyone to, quote, go look up in the dictionary what bipartisanship is. It's both parties working together, not your party doing a bill and then saying it's bipartisan. So in less than 4 months, we've had two completely different versions of the Democratic leader. The two of them could have had a fascinating debate with each other. But look, the real tragedy here is not Senate process. It's how ill-suited this bill is to what Americans need right now. No policies to get schools reopened right away. No smart solutions to directly spur rehiring. Less than 1% of the money goes to the vaccines that will end this nightmare. Only 9% to the entire healthcare fight altogether. I guess it's become a rite of passage for a new Democratic president to begin with a poorly targeted spending spree that doesn't give Americans what they need. We already laid the foundation for a roaring comeback. The Biden administration inherited a tide that was already turning, but they've chosen to ignore the approach that got us this far. Now, on one final matter, yesterday evening, House Democrats repassed their plan to give Washington unprecedented power over the way our nation conducts elections. Just like their partisan spending spree from last week, the only thing bipartisan about the vote was the opposition. The same party that wants to change Senate rules when they lose a vote, pack the Supreme Court when they lose a case, and throw out the Electoral College every time they lose the White House, now wants to forcibly rewrite 50 states' election laws from Washington. It's unprincipled, it's unwarranted. Large portions of it may well be unconstitutional. One of the key principles of American elections is that federal office holders cannot personally micromanage the ways in which voters can hire and fire us. Different states and localities settle questions around early voting or absentee voting or voter registration in very different ways. Washington Democrats want every county in America to have the answer to all those questions the way they want. For example, no state would be able to have a simple voter ID requirement unless they neuter it with a massive loophole. But every state would be forced to allow ballot harvesting, where paid political operatives can show up carrying a stack of ballots with other people's names on them. Imagine looking at this national landscape where we've seen the losing side doubt the legitimacy of 2 consecutive presidential elections and thinking this is the time for a sweeping one-party rewrite of election law. Democrats are also coming after America's free speech. The Federal Election Commission was set up after Watergate to be a bipartisan panel by design. The FEC intentionally needs bipartisan consensus to throw a penalty flag. Washington Democrats want to scrap that as well. Their bill would convert the FEC into an odd-numbered partisan body, and this partisan FEC would get even greater scope to nose around in even more of America's speech and America's activities. The bill also tramples on citizens' privacy with new mandates that would intensify cancel culture and help mobs harass people for their private views. Even the left-wing ACLU condemns this part of H.R. 1. This is what the ACLU had to say. It could directly interfere with the ability of many to engage in political speech about causes that they care about and that impact their lives, end quote, from the ACLU. That's right, House Democrats have swung so far to the anti-free speech left, they've even lost the ACLU. Speaking of political swigs, Democrats also want Washington to take over elections should remember that majorities in Congress actually come and go. It would be absurd for election regulations in every precinct in America to go boomeranging back and forth every time Congress changes hands. Millions of American voters elected 50 Republican senators and a whole lot of House Republicans to make sure that Democrats play by the rules, not rewrite the rules. For one party to seize unilateral control over elections nationwide would be a civic catastrophe. It's worth asking, why are Washington Democrats so desperate to forcibly rewrite election law before the next time voters decide their fates?
Under the previous order, the leadership time is reserved.
Mr. President.
Majority Whip.